All right, so I'm just going to get started with, I guess, a React functional-based component example. And then, again, we'll make an API call. I think that was Mike Zura's suggestion. But anything else we want to see with React, I think this might be a good opportunity to do it. Let me brighten my screen there. All right, so yeah, let's just create a React app. So I guess it's going to take a few seconds here.
You're not sharing your screen, Alfred.
Oh, my bad. Always forget one step. I remember to record, but I forgot to share. All right, there we go. All right, let me make sure. All right, as always, to create a React app, I gotta do npx create React app, and then I could give it a name, but in this case, I want to just drop it into my front end folder that I just made. So let's go there. So npx create React app, and that'll take maybe a good minute to download all the files. So one neat thing I learned yesterday, so again, always still kind of learning about VS Code. Maybe some of you guys already knew this, but you can actually debug a front end and a back end API all in one project, and it's kind of cool. So you kind of see, you can set breakpoints on your front end, and then also set it on your back end target, and kind of see how your code is progressing through your entire application. So that was something cool.
Hey, Encore, while that's downloading, talking about debugging, where do you typically set your breakpoints? Is it right at what you're looking at, like whatever variable you're trying to see what it is, or where do you how do you pick it?
Yeah, so again, I think we all have our own debugging styles. I know I do this often, so I'm not trying to downplay it, but I often use console logs and just print out stuff at console and kind of see what values I have. But yeah, when you set breakpoints, you have access to a watch list. So you could also kind of track a variable that way instead of doing console logs. And we could kind of maybe see that in action too.
Oh yeah. If I debug, I'll actually, I don't know if you know about the keyword debugger. If you just put debugger any place in your code in JavaScript, it'll stop right there. It's almost like a breakpoint. And then you can just review or see all the different variables that up until that point.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that was a thing. We'd love to try that. Okay, so we got our React app going. Let's start it up and mess around with it. All right, someone's using my port. Seems like I always have that. All right, there you are. All right, so we have our local React app that we're used to seeing here. All right, so that's the base React app. Let's get to changing that. So I'm going to go to my app.js and delete all this good stuff. And yeah, let's just get a simple example going here. So I'm going to actually create a new component. And let's create a components directory. And let's call this fun button. I don't know. So this will be a React functional component. So I will use my snippet. So again, basic structure here. Again, hopefully you guys are familiar with basic requirements. Are just you create a function, you take in props if your component wants to use props, and then you return some JSX from it. And then you got to export your component as always with any JSX module. So I'm going to name this fun button, I guess is what I settled on. Hopefully this button is entertaining. All right, and then I need to include that over here. So let's do that right now. Fun button. All right, there we go. So right now we're not passing any props down here. All this button is going to do is, let's add a button. Get an input in here maybe, placeholder. Okay, so this should be a straightforward item. Again, we have a label, input, and a button. Let me make that a little bigger. Okay, and just because I like my items on new lines, I'm going to add some breaks here. Okay, so we have a value and a button that we can enter. So right now we're not going to do anything with it, so we need to give some functionality. So let's add an on-click handler here. So this will be some functionality, let's say handle click. Okay, so again, this is a functional component. We create functions within our function to handle logic as needed. So this will be handle click. So the click event like automatically generates an event. So that's actually a parameter that gets passed to any handler that you have. And then you can handle some properties of that event. So in this case, event will be, does it have an event? Forget what the properties are for on click. On click. All right, maybe there's no actual event. Mouse events. All right. So I guess, yeah, you have access to various items. So we could see like page X maybe returns a horse. All right, let's try using some of this. So we have event. I think page X might be something. And then, all right, so just to get using this, let's create a state item. So again, state is a way to keep track of values that are gonna be maintained by your component. So we'll do const have position. Again, you can name this function whatever you want. Obviously, it just makes more sense to call it a set on your value. So we'll do that state, and initial value will be sort of 0. So sets use state is from React. So we need to import that. I feel like half the time VS Code does import it for me, and the other half it makes me do it. So I'm not sure what to expect. So I'll do it here from React. All right, so I just want to print out my position. So I'm going to grab my position here, and then I'm going to update my position. Is that how the event works? We'll try. Let's ask the audience. So who haven't I chatted with in a while? Caitlin, can I ask you? So I want to basically track the position of where my mouse is. That's what this value should be. And then I want to update my position. What happens if I just do something like this? What will this do to my position value, and what would I expect out of this?
It's not going to set your state. You would have to use set state, right?
Yeah, so I would want to use my set position. What does that actually achieve? As in, why can't I just do this directly to my state object or value?
I know we're not supposed to set state directly because it can cause issues, but I don't know the exact reason why.
Gotcha. Yeah, so the reason we need to do that is because state is kind of managed by React. So when we use the update function, in this case, set position, that's actually gonna, React is gonna use that and then force a re-render. If we simply update our position directly here, React is not gonna know that that value changed, and then a render won't happen. So let's actually try seeing this in action. So if I just print out this value, I have no break lines here. So I want to render the position of my mouse, and that's going to happen every time I click. So again, e.pagex, I think that should work. Let's also log it for good measure. And okay, so Okay, so this, anytime I click, it should tell me the coordinates of the X coordinate of my mouse. All right, so e.pagex was that target. Apologies, I don't really use this event often, so pass it in. And this is a great opportunity to debug, so I'm going to take that opportunity because I always seem to. So I'm just going to kill this page, and then hopefully you guys aren't bored with this, but I just want to make sure we know how to do it. So I'm going to create a launch.json file. Again, I go to my debug panel. There was a launch, or create a launch.json file. Here I'm just going to update the port because my React server is running on 3000. And then all of this can remain the same. Don't need to add anything else. All right, now that that's created, I could just go to the debug menu, and that'll create attached Chrome window to my debugger. So let's see what's going on here. Gotta pull this up again. Okay, let's click this and see what event is. So E is, all right, this event, it has a bunch of stuff in it. Again, hopefully you guys can see this text. If not, I know it's really tiny, so let's pull that up. All right, so there's all these values on the event. So there's a client X, client Y, so maybe that's something I want to use. There is a page X, page Y, so looks like I was incorrect the first time. But let's change our code then, save that, and rerun it. Without 2 dots though. Okay, let's do this again. All right, page X is 491, so that's approximately where my mouse was on the page. Okay, so we get an error. So we can't even do that for our save variable. I thought we might be able to do this and it would let us, but apparently React protects us, so that's maybe another reason not to do that directly. So yeah, we want to call our setter, and that will trigger re-render. So if I do this, Y position. All right, let's get rid of errors and warnings. I just want to see info. All right, so it's printing out my page X value here. I'm not sure why it's not updating here. Anyone see an issue here? So I have position, set position, page X. I feel like that should be good. All right, what am I missing here? So I set position, and I'm checking position here. Anyone have any thoughts?
Is it because you don't have a prevent default and it's just refreshing it so you can't actually see it, or?
No. So I have my default as 0, and then it changes. Like I'm logging it correctly, or I'm getting a different value each time. Right. So I would think that my.
I think, Aqua, I think you have a capital P there. Page X, line 8.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Not sure why I can't pick up those small mistakes by you guys, especially when I'm coding, but there we go. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, all right, so there we go. So we're updating the X position every time we actually do move our mouse and click on it. So cool, that's what I wanted to see there. All right, so that's, again, basic functional component, nothing too exciting going on here, but let's kind of jazz it up a bit. So we talked about our hooks. So there's 4 main hooks that I think we've mentioned before. The 3 predominant ones are use state, which we just saw. So hopefully you guys kind of understand that. Important note, things to keep in mind about use state. So we mentioned this and just want to reiterate it. This setter is asynchronous. So do not rely on the position value in this case to be updated right after, because it's going to do this at some point in the future, but not right away. So we can't simply do like a console log here and expect that position is going to be what we just had it to, right? So if you want to see that in play, pretty easy to see that. If I click this button, notice it took the previous value. So I guess that's not as clear to see. Let's see. Let me just clear my console then. All right, so if I click here, the previous value is 510. So if I click on this button, notice that 510 is what gets printed out here, because that's the previous value, even though the new value is 462. That's being printed with our first console.log. So again, just key takeaway with set state, I think most of us should understand what set state is doing, is keeping track of a value. The only caveat is if you forget that it's asynchronous, you can get into trouble and you might be using the wrong value. So again, the correct way to do this is gonna be with our next hook value, which is our hook function, which is use effect. And this is probably the trickiest to understand. So please, please, please ask questions. So this keeps track of values, allows for logic. Okay, so use effects is useful because you can do some logic after some state value changes, or as I put in parentheses, prop value. So if you have prop values being passed down from your parent, use effect kind of just is the place where you handle anything you want to do from a change. So that's what I'm going to introduce, talk about next is use effect. Sorry, before I finish up use state, any questions on use state, please do ask. Again, basic construct is use state. You pass in a default value if you want to. That's optional. If you don't pass it in, this will probably just be a null value. Usually it's good practice to specify default if it makes sense. So that's use state. Again, this will update position to be that value. And then this is just a setter function that you can use to actually update your state. If you try to update your state directly, as we found out, React will actually yell at you and prevent you from doing that, because it treats this as a constant value. I wonder if, yeah, so if we change this to not const, will we be able to set it? So we're doing that. But if we just did position equals page x. All right, let's try to do that. We'll React yell it up. Okay, no, so we could actually do this. So the reason before was because we had this as const, and again, that's just protection for ourselves. That's why we always use const when with use state. But apparently, if you make this a non-const value, sorry, not this. So to make this let, so this is just a normal variable that can be written to. In this case, this lets us do it, but it's not going to trigger re-render. So notice that my console was writing out 470. I clicked like it's like 10 times, but my value over here never changed, right? It's 462. The reason is because React doesn't know that this internal state is updating, right? We're updating it, but the re-render is never happening. So again, that kind of highlights why you should never assign directly. Again, I'm not sure if there's a really fringe use case where this would make sense, but common practice is just don't update state manually. So that's why we use const to protect ourselves there. And then at this point, when we try to do this, React or JavaScript knows this is a const value, so it won't even let us do this. So yeah, it's kind of hard to make that accident if you're using const properly. So let's get rid of that because we don't want to do something that's bad practice. Let's get rid of these console logs. Okay, so any questions on use state? You guys are all professionals with use state. You guys are good with it. All right, use effect. That's the trickier one. Definitely is a lot to kind of pack into one function. But use effect is simply a function that gets called that takes in a parameter of a function. So we use anonymous functions. Just easier to do it here. Again, you could kind of break this out into a separate function if you wanted to. So use effects. This is where you do items that you want to do in reaction to state updating. So in this case, when we set position, let's say we actually wanted to console log the new position. Well, that's easy to do here. We simply log it out. So we do page X, and yeah, so that should be logged out. So let's see this quickly. All right, we don't have the position. All right, so we have position here, and I just want to log that out. So notice that we call set position. That will React will automatically trigger the use effect whenever this update happens. So this is asynchronous. So whenever this update goes through and updates position, which is our state value, use effect will trigger and will log our new position. So if I do that and do it here, all right, so 504 is indeed our new position, and that's what got printed out to our console. Notice I have the 0 here. Let's see. Brian Jensen, can you tell me why the 0 was printed out here? If you know.
It's likely because that's the initial value that you gave it, and so it's it's printing it somewhere in your code prior to the use effect.
Correct. Yeah. The only change I would make to your answer would be use effect is actually getting called twice. So the important thing to know about use effects is any of your use effects. Again, you can have multiple use effects in here, and we'll talk about why that makes sense. But actually, on your initial render of your component, use effect gets called. So if we go back to our component lifecycle methods, component did mount, that gets fired. Let's bring up that fancy diagram. React components. All right, so again, great diagram. Hopefully you guys have been messing around with this page, or even just at least kind of used it at some point to kind of understand. But yeah, so mounting is when your component is first created and then rendered. So it'll call your constructor if this is a class-based component. Again, this is all related to class-based components in terms of the methods. But for your component, when it's mounting, your constructor will get invoked, and then a render will happen. After that render, component did mount gets called. Again, this is class-based components. So that logic actually happens in your use effects. The very first time your component renders, use effect gets called. Then anytime any update happens, so just to review, an update can happen if your props change from your parent being passed down, or if you call set state, which we're doing with the set position, or if you call force update. Again, I've never really used that. There might be use cases for it. But anyway, any update that happens, component did update will get triggered, and that's also happening in the single use effect. So again, use effect is kind of bundling both of those lifecycle methods together, component did mount and component did update. So that's why that 0 was printed out initially, because when I brought this page up, it rendered the component, and so that 0, which was my initial value, got printed out. So if I actually wanted to change that default value, obviously I could. So if I make it 77, not sure why this panel keeps coming back. Notice I have a 77 here, but I didn't even click a button, right? So that's because my page refreshed because I changed my code. And now when I click, it will show the new values. Okay. But this works for my needs because I only have one state item, right? But what if I added a new value here? So let's say this will be, let's actually use our input because we're not using our inputs, and all right, so this will be a string value that the user types in. So we'll track it with an on change. We have a function for that, so handle input change. And this will take an event also. And we just want to set input. Here will be event.target.value. And you need to always pass this in. I'm actually curious. Put a breakpoint here. Breakpoint, please. Fresh. Okay, so we hit our breakpoint. Event has something in it. So I guess I don't need to manually pass it in. Is that correct? Thought I was getting an error before. Continue. Okay, that seems to work. So yeah. Okay, so we have two state values now. We have an input and we have a position. Right? Let's actually print out our input. This. Okay, so if I continue my debugger here, so my input value is F. If I change that to U, right? But notice, again, it's not super easy to notice, but notice what's being printed out to my console. I'm changing this value. So let's say I put this to hello world, right? Notice that I got 13 printouts of my X position, right? That's what the current stored X position is 470. So that printed out every time I typed a character in my input value, that updates. So if I want to add a new value, I got 502 as my new value. Anytime I change something here, notice I get all those printouts. So it condenses it. So there's 9 instances of 502. But that's happening every time. And again, that is because use effects, as I have it right now, it's getting called anytime any of my states change. So in this case, input is changing. My position value is staying the same because I'm not clicking that button. But use effects is triggering each time because my component is updating, and that's what use effects is kind of listening for. Any questions on why we're getting this console log each time? All right, so the way use effects can be managed is with a dependency array. So that's what the second parameter, again, this is optional. So sometimes it might make sense that you want to do some update all the time, no matter what changes. You might want to have some logic that triggers for your component. But in this case, I don't want to print out my position because I already know what it is, I guess in my console. In that case, I can have a dependency array. So this will kind of dictate when this particular use effect gets called. So if I pass in my position value here, now this use effect will only fire in 2 cases. One is on the initial re-render, or sorry, the initial render, which is your component did mount logic. So this will happen one time, but this use effect will only trigger after that when my position value actually changes. So if I simply by adding this, if I go back to my page here, let's clear my console. So my current position is 502. Let's kind of change that. So it's 457. Great. Let me start typing something here. Notice I'm not getting any updates to my console here because that use effect now is not, this is no longer firing because of this dependency array. Do you guys kind of understand the use of the dependency array? Again, you can put multiple values in here. So if I did have like a prop that position might depend on, then I could have whatever else I want in here. So you can kind of control the use effect. And again, this is a good opportunity to show that you can use multiple use effects. You're not limited to just one use effect. So in this case, let's have another use effect, and this will be our console log for our input value. Okay, but just like before, we don't want to fire this off every time. So I'm going to add a dependency list or dependency array and only print out my input when the input actually changes. Okay, so we have 2 use effects. There's nothing wrong with that. So in this case, I click, all right, I'm getting my random values that I'm clicking on the button, not random, but as I'm moving the mouse. And then let's try typing something. So I'll say hello world. All right, notice that now I'm just getting my text because that's the new input values. All right, so again, that's the whole purpose of use effect. You're reacting to state changes or prop changes, which we can cover also. Okay, I'm going to add some more logic here. So instead of printing this out, I'm just going to print out components update. So this is something we went over in lecture, and just want to go over it one more time because it's definitely not, I guess, obvious. But as I mentioned, this will fire in 2 cases, after the initial render and then after any update to input. So if I wanted to quickly check that out, refresh, get rid of this. All right, so let me refresh one more time. Okay, so looking at my console, I just cleared it. All right. Does anyone know how to get it from automatically going to the sources tab when the page re-renders? I haven't quite figured that out. It's kind of annoying, but all right. So notice in my output, I have 77, which is my initial value. For whatever reason, I picked 77. And my initial state for input was blank, but in that case, I'm just printing out component did update. But actually, that's kind of misleading, right? Because it did update, but our lifecycle method that triggered this is actually component did mount. So what if we actually only wanted to call that use effects actually when the input value updates, not from the initial render? So that's something, again, we went over this in lecture, but just want to go over it one more time. So let's actually mimic component did mount, or did update without doing the component did mount. We had to add some additional logic. And this is where I'm going to introduce our third hook, use ref, which is still kind of mysterious because we haven't talked about it. We haven't used it too much. But use ref, again, is very useful. And I'm going to go over the two main use cases for it. So it can be used to track DOM element, or can be used Okay, so there's two ways we could use useRef. Again, maybe there are more use cases, but one way is to track DOM elements, and the other is just to track values without using state. And we're gonna see why useRef can be useful in certain cases, depending on what you're trying to do. So in this case, I need some value to tell me if this is an initial render or if this is an update. So we can use useRef to have a value. So in this case, I'll do let initial useRef. And then you could pass it a default value. So in this case, initial will be true. All right, so this initial is actually an object. It's not like a normal variable, you know, like when you do let blah equals something. It's not quite like that. So useRef is actually returning an object. And that object, if we want to investigate it, let's totally do it. So I'm going to do console.log initial. Let's take a look at it. And I need to include it. Ref. Okay, so I've used ref there. Back to my console. All right, so notice I have this object here. Again, let me know if it's too small to see. Let me blow up my console a bit. All right, so I have this object that got printed out. And notice it just has one value in. The property is current and the value is true. So current is just the default property that's going to be in your ref. You don't really have control over that. That's just what it is. And then the value is whatever value you had. So I set it to true. Notice I have true on line 11. Let's actually update that. So unlike state values, you can update refs directly, and that's totally fine because React is not going to re-render based on refs. React will re-render based on state changes, but not refs. So in this case, let's use our initial. So if we have initial equal to true, I'll just make this explicit, true. Let's just return. So this is going to not do anything on the initial render, but let's actually update our initial value. So again, just to remember, initial is actually an object, not a value. So that current property is what I actually care about. So initial.current, and I'll set that to false. All right, so I'm using my useRef value that I created on line 11, and I got to check current, my bad. So again, .current is just the actual value you care about. So in this case, I'm checking if my current value is true. If it is, I'm just going to go into this if branch, set it to false, and then return. So basically, I don't want to print out component did update, but let's actually print out console.log component did mount. So yeah, this logic is for your component did mount. Again, this is coming from class-based components, but now we're in functional world, so that's where use effect will simulate component did mount in this case, and then any other time this is called, it's going to be a component did update case. So you see this in action. Go back here, clear this, refresh. Okay, so notice that we got our component did mount. We haven't updated anything ourselves, but we got that initial render and that use effect got called once. Now, anytime we do this, let's type in values. Yeah, so now we're getting these component updates. Every time I type, my ref, again, stays false because that's the value I had, but now I'm just going to get these component updates over and over again. It's kind of hard to see because it's a chain of them. Yeah, so that's component did mount and component did update. So if you only want to do this, you need this additional bit of logic to kind of ignore the initial render.
Hey, Ankur, one question. On line 22, should that be a what am I trying to say? Is that considered setting that value directly by initial.current equals false, or does it not matter because it's inside the function?
We are setting it directly, yes, and it's totally okay because this is a use ref. That's the whole differentiation between use state and use ref. Use state, you need to use this setter function because React is actually listening for changes on the position value. Versus use ref, React doesn't care about refs at all. It's not monitoring this value. This is only for our internal use only. So in this case, yeah, I can set it directly and React is gonna not even know. Like, I mean, it might know, but it's not gonna re-render based on that value because it's not monitoring this. React only monitors states and props, and ref is neither one of those. So yes, we're setting it directly. Again, this is just an object that has a current property. We're setting it, and React is not going to react to it.
What's the difference between just setting initial to true instead of using useRef?
Great question. So this is actually a function. So if I set this to true, let's actually see what happens. Maybe this might work. So if we do something like this, right? So we have have a variable in our function, and then this will, yeah, let's give this a try. So refresh here, console, React component did mount. All right, notice this is always saying component did mount. So the reason is, again, it's kind of hard to like kind of understand this component, but this component is just a function. So anytime you call this function, it's going to execute all this code, right? Each time that this function is called. So this initial value gets initialized each time this function gets called, and it's always going to set it to true. So like when we do this initial to set initial to false, like that value updates, but the next time this function gets called by React, we reinitialize it to true.
Okay, thank you.
The other way could be if we made this like a static value. Is that keyword? No. Sorry, I'm not.
So useRef in this case kind of like sets a conditional to it.
Not a conditional. It creates it, but also maintains the value between function calls. So again, useRef is still doing some magic behind the scenes, but React just doesn't render from it changing. So set variable.
Basically, to make it static, you would just instantiate it outside the function.
Gotcha. Static. There's a static keyword there, right? That's what I was trying to use.
In Java, there is. I don't know about JavaScript.
I guess it works in classes, but not functions. But yeah, so the reason, then the next suggestion might be, hey, why not? Let's just keep a variable out here, and let's see how this runs. So I create a variable on line 8, and I'm using it within my function. So let's, all right, refresh this. Sorry for all the miscellaneous elements here, but hopefully you guys are following along. So I have input, and then I have a component mount. Let's actually type something in here. So I do H, I guess. All right, we got a component update. That's what we expected, right? So anytime I type, I'm getting component update, which totally makes sense because I'm actually changing a state value, and that's triggering my use effects. However, there's a problem here. Can someone tell me why this isn't ideal? If you guys know.
Because another function or something could update that value.
Yep. So let's actually try that out.
Because it's outside the function.
Yep. It's just some variable that exists. So if I have 2 components, let's say I have 2 fun buttons. Hopefully this renders. All right, it's going to stack it. I actually want to make this next to each other. So let's do some CSS. Apologies for the detour, but always good to dabble in some CSS. So in this case, I'm going to give this, I guess that's a class name, so use it. Go to my file explorer, find app.css. So that was app. So here I'm going to create a display of flex, and flex flow will be a row. I probably want to break this up into something else, but let's just go with it. Border. Hey, Brendan, you around?
I'm around.
What was the, do you remember the ordering? I remember you helped me out last time.
It doesn't matter the order.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm learning something every day. So I can do thickness, style, and color. All right, there we go. So we got some borders. Let's add margin quickly. Margin. Make it 16 pixels. Sounds like a good number. Got my there.
Just for margin, if you wanted to do order, it goes top right, bottom left. If you wanted to.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I remember that one. I always just get confused with stuff like top. Yeah, you could go top right, bottom left. So kind of in a clockwise order. Yeah, we could do that. We could do like a 50 pixel. So this will be our top margin, and then our right margin. Yeah, where? All right, so we got two of our fun buttons components rendered. So that was some CSS detour. Okay, so just to review, in case we lost track, the change we made was we created this, I guess, static or local variable to this function or to this file, but this is outside of our function, right? So initial is true, but the problem here, as I think Jeremy was saying, is that let's see what actually happens when we re-render our page. So notice we got a component did mount, and notice our value was true, and we got a second component printout. This is component did update, because we have two components here. So what actually happened is the first component used that value of true, got into our if statement of component did mount, and set that value to false. So that's what this component did. Now this component is still using that same value that the first component is, so they're both sharing that value. And so in that case, after the first component set it to false, our second component did the same use effects, but at that point, the initial value was false. So it thought that we're doing a component did update, which is not actually true. It was reacting to a component did mount also, because both of these are identical. They're going through the same life cycle, right? So that's the reason why we can't simply just have a variable out here and try to use it, because if we have multiple copies of the same component, they're going to be sharing this value. So that's, again, why useRef is really useful. So I'm going to go back to our previous item of initial. Initial equals useRef, and our initial value is true.
Hey, Ankur, I have a question. Yep. Not exactly about this. I was looking up in the documentation. I got kind of confused. If you have an event, when would you do like .target versus .current target? I don't really know the difference on that.
Yeah, that's a totally fair question to ask. It's more about just knowing each event in particular. So again, I don't always know what the event has on it. So if we go, like this is a mouse event, if you want to search on keyboard event, or let's see. Yeah, keyboard event, is that the one? Input events. Input type. Yeah, again, I don't know all the events, but some events have a target on them, and that's what we use for input. I'm trying to figure that out here. So let's see, data. But yeah, I mean, we can investigate it based on our breakpoint here. So fresh.
I was just curious because I tried looking into it just because I was curious, and then it got confusing.
Yeah, okay, so this is something called synthetic base events. Is it on change? Is that the actual event? Again, I'm just trying to read what's in here. So is there an on change event? On change event JavaScript. Okay, there's on change. It's an event type. All right, so that has target. So yeah, so again, it's just kind of knowing what properties exists. So again, I just went to onChange, which is what we're handling. And then that is just a generic event. So events has all these available items. In this case, target is something that we just have to know that's what actually has the values that we care about. I know that's not a great answer, but yeah. So I'm glad you were reading documentation, trying to figure it out. That's the developer way to do it. Like I haven't memorized all the events and what properties exist. Whenever I need to use them, I will kind of jog my memory. If I don't remember, I'm going to go to documentation. So great step there. But yeah, this target actually has the value that we care about. So event.target, and then we could strip off the value in that case. So I guess target is referring to the element. So I guess that's the input element, and the input element has a value field on it.
Yeah, helps a little bit. Thank you.
Sorry, okay. Gotcha. Any other questions? I think we have paused for questions, and we probably should take a break soon. All right, so going back to our new approach was to use ref. So we saw that we just can't have a variable inside the function because that's going to get recreated each time. We can't have a variable outside of the function because that's going to be shared by multiple components. So that's where use ref is your magic solution, or your magic ticket there that solves both issues. It's going to create a value for each component, but it's not going to recreate it each time that this function component is called by React. All right, so we had initial.current, and initial.current. Okay, so that's one use case of useRef. That's where we're just tracking values. And again, we can update it directly, and React is not going to re-render. So kind of to highlight this, maybe I should have done this first if I were playing this out a little better. But let's have a number value. Or let's say, yeah, let's just have B0. Let me just code this up and we'll talk about it. So let's create another use effect. Sorry, function in there. And what will this do? This will do, let's see, set clicks. All right, so I actually want to change up. I don't want to track my position anymore. So let's actually not do that. Let's do, sorry. Yeah, let's just do this. So my handle click will, I think about this. Oh, right. Sorry, I got it. I think. Do that. All right, let's just go with this. I think I didn't think about this correctly, but what if I have I have a set clicks or click value? So anytime I'm going to click this button, let's just say, how do I do this? So I click this button, it's called handle click. I don't care about position right now. So I want to set clicks here. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, let's try this. Let's ignore this use effects. Okay, so this should work if I remember this correctly. So if I click, all right, cool. All right, clicks. So this is something we've seen before where we just wire up a counter. I think Tom had an example of this where you could just have a button that counts its clicks. Totally fine, that works. But what if we want to do something a little different? I'm trying to recall what I was trying to set up here. So clicks. Okay, so if we had to use effects, that guy back. All right, not that this is sensible at all. Can someone tell me what this use effect will be doing? So let's say we update something else. Let's say we update inputs. Sure. And then, sorry, I have a really bad example here, so maybe we should abandon it. So it's 9:40. We've been going for maybe an hour. Let's take a break while I try to figure out what I was trying to accomplish here. And then we'll get back to talking about useref. All right, so let's take a, we got some time. Let's take an 11-minute break. Be back at 9:50, and then maybe we'll go for another hour and then get to our, we'll take a break and then go to our presentation. So yeah, 9:50, so 10-minute break, and let's get back to this. All right, so yeah, while we were on break, I was just trying to quickly create a class-based component just so we could kind of compare. Almost done with that, so I'm gonna finish that up here. Okay, hopefully that's all I need. What am I missing? Set state, and a click. Okay. Set state. All right, hopefully that should take care of it. Basically, I just wanted to create two components that are basically identical. So on my right side, I have a class-based component. Let me try to make more real estate here. File Explorer. And then on the left side, I have our fun button. So we have class button and then functional fun button. All right, so in my app.js, I have one instance of each, but effectively they each should be identical, right? One is just using functions, one's using classes, but they're doing the same thing. Hopefully I transfer everything over. So again, kind of to compare and contrast, I have this use effect that I created while we were on break. So this use effect can accomplish what these three lifecycle methods are doing. Again, it's just different ways to do the same exact thing, one in a class-based component world, the other in a functional-based component world. So if you look at our component did mount, that's the logic we talked about earlier, where we're using that ref value and then monitoring the state of that to determine if we're actually doing the did mount or did update. So again, this is the same as having component did mount in a class-based component. Then we have our did update. That is reflected simply by this line. So use effect will trigger, again, the key thing here is I have no dependency array. So this is going to update for any re-render, which is the same with a class-based component. Anytime any state value changes, whether it be position or input or prop value, component did update will trigger, will be called by React. All right, so this is the same thing because I have no dependency array here. And finally, component will mount. We haven't really used this too much. Again, this is where you want to clean up any resources that aren't needed anymore. But that's done by returning a function that will be called when this function is actually getting unmounted from the DOM. All right, so three functions reflected in the functional-based world here. Any questions? Or I'll pause to let you guys kind of digest that and check out anything. So with use effect, as we talked about, we can use a dependency array, right? Like for this use effect where we just want to print out position. Anytime position changes, we're going to console log it. And again, we had to do this because set position is asynchronous, so we can't just simply do it right after calling set position. If we did want to do something like that in our class-based world, it is achievable. So if you notice, component did update takes in some values. There's a previous props and previous state. So you could actually inspect the previous values and then determine what you want to do. So in this case, if I wanted to mimic this use effect in my class-based world, I would do if previous state dot position not equal to what is it? The current state. So this dot state dot position. All right. So again, this gets called after your values have changed. So you can actually inspect the previous state because that's something that React passes to this function. And then if that is true, you can do some logic here. All right. So that's the same as this use effect that we had before in our functional component. If you want to do the similar thing, we could inspect the previous and the current state values for position. And likewise, we could do the same for our input. So quickly code that up. Input not equal to this state input. And then we'll just console log since that's what we're doing. I guess we should have our brackets just to be safe, but in this case they're optional because they're one-line ifs. Just keep that in mind if you ever see that. It's totally fine for one-line ifs not to have those brackets, but always good to be more clear. So console log, and this should be input. And this was input before. Okay, so again, we're achieving the same things, just different ways to go about it. In class-based world, we have these functions, and we could do all of that in one function. Versus in functional components, we could separate each hook for each state value. Again, my preference, I actually prefer class-based components for lifecycle methods because to me, it's totally clear to have a function and I know when this can be called. Versus, again, doing this in a use effect is a little messier. They're all kind of bundled together, so it's not easy to piece it out just from reading the code. Any questions about class-based components versus function-based components? Okay. Please stop me at any point, but I'm going to continue on with talking about useRef, so our class component can go away for now. So useRef, another thing I wanted to highlight. And again, we've done this before, so apologies if it's kind of redundant, but wanted to just kind of highlight useRef again. So the way we have it right now, we're going to have an update anytime we type into our, what happened here? Oh, right. Sorry about that. I always forget my thises. So this dot state input, this dot state dot input. All right, that should clear up our class.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Please,
Okay.
please.
I'm trying to understand the E as the event, and they all have the handle input change and the handle click. They both have E's events, but they are different. They are different, right? And they're out of each other's scope.
Yeah. So yeah, these values. This is a variable. Like we can name this whatever we want. I can name this donuts. I can name this ice cream. Yeah. So these are just variables. So an event is being passed to our function, and we're just capturing it into a function variable here. And so this is going to be whatever event is passed to it. So yeah, you know, maybe we want to name it separately to make it more clear. But in this case, yeah, whatever we name our variable, we access it because we know it's going to be an event.
And where does that event, is that happening in the return? Or where does it get created? When the on click or handle click is called?
Yeah, so that's taken care of by, I guess, the window object. So when you actually click on that button element, it's going to create that event object through whatever process it goes through, and then it's going to pass that event object to your JavaScript handler. So yeah, we're not creating that event. We're not managing that event. That event is being generated from the window that we clicked on, or the button. Like if I clicked on this button, my browser knows that I clicked on it. It's going to say, all right, you clicked on this button in this position where your mouse was. And again, it just knows all those properties and passes that to our code in case we want to use it. But yeah, let me change my values back. So I just use E. There's something weird. I don't know the details on, but if you use event, it says deprecated and it crosses out sometimes. So that's why we often use E instead of event, but in this case, it seems like it's fine. Yeah, so you get this weird note, like event is deprecated. That's because event is like a reserved keyword also. So that's why I often just use E, so I don't get those weird, it'll still work. It's just VS Code or whatever has some information about like a pre-reserved keyword, and then it's deprecated through whatever version that it's no longer used. So, okay, But yeah, thanks for asking that question. But yeah, that's just a variable name, so we can name it as we wish. We just know we're going to get a particular event. In our input change event, we get an on change event. In our button click, we get a mouse input event or mouse click event. And again, that's where, again, going back to documentation, you can kind of figure out what you have access to. So we had the mouse click event for a button, and that has a whole bunch of information that could be useful. Mouse events. So you can even tell like what button they click. Like if you're on a Windows machine, you might have a right or left, right? You could get, again, if the shift key was down, so if they did a shift click, you could do a different behavior. Again, I've not used a lot of this. I don't even know what which is. Return which mouse button was pressed. Okay, sorry, that's, I guess, which mouse button. I don't know what the difference between buttons versus which is. Okay. All right, so going back to our useRef discussion. The other way you can use useRef is, let's see. Okay, so we've done this before, but I'm going to do it again. So this input value is firing an on-change event anytime the user types something in, right? That's not usually ideal. Like we don't want to re-render usually, because usually the mechanic is the user will type something, and then they will hit click, and then we'll actually use their input value, right? So like if this was like a paragraph field where they're writing like a bio of themselves, we don't really care about each character they're typing, right? We just want to know, hey, they typed up a biography about themselves. When they hit some button to submit it, that's when we actually want to process the input. We don't necessarily need to process it each time, right? So this is where ref also comes into play. Again, there's different ways to do this. You can use just like get document, get element by ID from the document, which we've done before. But the React way, as we've seen before, let's create a ref for it. So let's input elements ref equals use ref. This will be null. All right, so this is another way to use ref. It's kind of a different use case, but each of your elements in JSX has this ref attribute. So here I could pass it my ref I just created. So that's input element ref. All right, so now this ref that I created is going to actually keep track of this input element. So in effect, this can be a reference to this input element. And that's handy because instead of tracking my input each time, so this use effect gets fired each time the user is typing each character, I don't really want to do that. I mean, I could print out to my console, but I don't want this rendering to happen, all right? So I actually want to change my functionality. So I no longer want this to keep updating until my user hits the click me button. Okay, so let's change that up. So I'm going to get rid of this use effect. I don't want to do this. Let me comment it out in case I want it back. Now I want to handle that in my button click. So my button should set the value. Sorry, my handle click here should set the value of input. Yeah. All right. So I can't do that right now because this event that I get is a mouse event. It's not related to that input control at all. So that's where the ref comes into play. So all I need to do here is instead of using e.target.value, which again doesn't exist here because this is a mouse event, all I have to do is do input element ref dot value, right? Because this is a reference to that actual input element, and that input element has a dot value property. So this is not position, sorry, this is input. So now I'm going to update my input only when the user hits that button. So if I save this and go here, oops, that is not what I expected. Why is that doing that? Oh, because I have that on change handler. So sorry, I want to get rid of this. So let's comment it in place. Nope, can't do that. Guess I get rid of it. All right, so we're no longer going to do it on change. We're only going to update that during the button. So now I can type. Notice that my input value output is not updating at all because I took away the on change handler. But now when I'm ready, or when the user is ready to submit their value, that is not what I have expected. Set input. See what's happening. Okay, I go here. Oh, I need that current. Yeah, so it's still ref, so it's an object. I needed that current value. So input element.ref.current is going to reference this input element, and then the value will be extracted from that. My apologies for getting that. So let's try that. Continue here. All right, there we go. So now we got the value out. So that's, again, just a better way to do it, because in this case, it doesn't make sense for me to capture each character. So that ref is very useful to kind of just reference your DOM elements. Again, we could do this by doing get element by ID and going through the JavaScript way, but this, I would argue, is much more convenient, where you could just hook up a ref attribute, pass it a ref value in your functional component, and then you just have access to that element whenever you want to use it. All right, so that's the second major use case for useRef. Again, definitely be handy, can get you out of a jam, or give you functionality that might not be as easy to achieve without this magical hook. Any questions about useRef? Please do ask. Again, I know we've not covered it too in depth, but documentation will kind of guide you. But also, what I went over are probably the two main use cases for it. Just keeping a value for a functional based component between function calls, and kind of referencing elements. So they're kind of two separate independent use cases, I guess, sort of. But they can, useRef can be useful in both cases. The last hook that we want to talk about is which one is it? I actually forget. React hooks.
Context?
I think someone said it, but I didn't quite catch it. So context, yes, context. Thank you. That is what you said. I didn't quite pick it out, but yep, context. So context, again, can be useful. I don't have a good use case for it right now because I don't really have nested elements and I don't have too many elements I'm dealing with. So in this case, context is not going to make much sense. Before I get into context, can someone tell me what context on a high level is doing or will do if I were using it? Let me ask Joe Patano, you're on my screen. Do you have a description for what use context kind of does on a high level?
Not really. I haven't really done a ton with the functional components.
Gotcha, that's fine. Yeah, that's where we can, so use context is a hook for functional-based components. Let's actually let's create a context and then use it, because that's something, it's a bit tricky. There's 3 steps to it. We got to create a context object, get a provider set up, and then get a consumer. So let's quickly go about doing that just to get a refresher. So let me create a new folder, call it context, just to organize my files. Again, this is optional, but organization goes a long way, especially as your project gets larger. Let's create, okay, let's create a render counter. Is that what I want to do? Sure, we'll go with it. All right, so I created this render counter context. Let's rename it. All right, so I need to create a context. So first thing I need to do is import create context. So this is regardless of if you're doing a function-based component or a class-based component, the context is the same. So create context is from React. Then I need to create my context. So we'll do let's render count context equals create context. And this can optionally take in a default value. But again, if you guys remember from my lecture, the default value isn't quite apparent when it's used. So I'm just going to leave it off because it's not really that useful. So no default value here. You can pass it in and it can be useful, but in this case, I know it doesn't matter. Render context, I'm going to export this. So export defaults. All right, so pretty simple to create a context. All you got to do is call this create context item, assign it to something, and then you can have access to it. All right, so that's my context creation. That was step 1. Step 2 is probably maybe the most difficult part. Maybe the consuming part is most difficult, but going to my app.js, going to include or import that context. So it's render context from this context. Okay, so now let's actually have some value here as a state. All right, looks like VS Code automatically inserted that time. Thank you, VS Code. All right, so render count, that's gonna track something. Okay, what else do I want to do here? Render count, let's pass it. So we need a, all right, so this is where we set up our provider. So when you use create context, that automatically creates the child components for your context. So if I do render context.provider, basically what this is saying is this, anything in this block is going to be provided a context value if they want to use it. They don't have to use it, but they totally can. So provider value, this is a predefined attribute. You have to use value. You can't kind of use whatever you want. And this will be what you want it to be. So this will be, let's see, render count. Sorry, render count. And then we want to close this. All right, so we need to drop our components in between here so that they could have access to this context if they want it. All right, so we're providing this value, and this value will be updating momentarily. But now these components can consume that value if they want to. So the alternative to this is I could just say, let's see, render counts equals render count. This is totally acceptable. Again, props, we're more familiar with props. Basically, this parent app can pass down any prop it wants down to any child component it wants. So this usually is the way we do it, but context is, if you guys remember, works when you have either a lot of data that you want to share across multiple components. Instead of having props on each of those components that you know it's going to be used in every component, you just have a context, and that kind of saves you from creating props for each child component. Or if you had really like deeply nested components and like one really specialized component needed some value from your parent, like 8 levels above, well, that's where context makes a lot more sense, because instead of passing those props down through 8 levels, you can just use a context, and the intermediate components will be oblivious to that value if they don't want to use it. All right, so I'm going to use context instead of using props. All right, let's go to our fun button and consume this value. So I'm going to set this to like 99, so we have something that's more unique. All right, so in here, I want to consume that context value. So this is where we use our final hook, which is use context, consume context values. So here I'll edit, so we have a refs, we have our states, and finally we have our context. So here I'm going to do, let's render count equal use context. And this will be my actual context. I'm going to import that. Import render context from where that was. Okay, so now that I have that, I can do render context. And now this will have access to that value. So if I actually want to put this out somewhere, we can totally do that. And if I hook this up correctly, then hopefully that should work. All right, so, all right, hopefully I didn't miss a step, but again, use context, you just pass it a context, and then the value that's provided from that context you have access to in your function. So let me see if I did this correctly. Use context not defined, because I didn't include it. Use context. Okay, let's see if that's happy. Set position, that's fine, okay. All right, so notice I got this render count in my child component, value of 99. That 99 came from my parents. If I go to my parents, Notice that the default value is 99, and then that's the value we're passing to the context. No props are being exchanged between our parent and child. Okay, so again, we're just providing a value somewhere in the cloud, and then any of these child components, if they want it, they could reach out to the sky, grab that value, and use it how they want to. Class-based components for context are a little more difficult. If we want to just complete the context story, let's actually do that for our class button. So yeah, this is a reason one reason I prefer functional methods over class-based components, because using context is a little trickier, a little messier, but not too much of an issue. So here I'm going to add a paragraph like I had in my functional component. I'm going to go back here. All right, so class-based component doing the same exact thing, but in this case, we need to have a consumer item. So here I'll have render, sorry, that should be consumer. So there's a dot consumer child component on context. So that's what I'm referencing there. All right, included it for me. Thank you, VS Code. I'm going to drop this in between here. All right, so now this element can consume that value if I want it to. So let's do that, but we need to add some magic code here. So this context will provide a value. That value is going to be render count. And then I will pass that value to this element here. I think that needs extra brackets. Kind of getting a lot of brackets here again. Kind of messy. That's why I don't like the syntax. All right, so this render count is being passed by the consumer, and then we could consume it as we wish. So in this case, we're just going to print it out. But if we wanted to pass it to a function, we totally could in this component. All right, let's give that a try and see if it did anything. All right, definitely messed something up. So render.
So do you not have to specify the context type in the bottom outside of the class component?
That is one way to do it. So the thing I was missing here, sorry, I'll get to that. Thank you for mentioning it. But yeah, I was forgetting return here. So this is actually an anonymous function. So passing a value and returning this element with.
If you would have left off those curly braces around the component, it would have also returned.
Yep, you're right. Yeah, I always get unsure inside of JSX because like I see this and it is one like line of JavaScript, but yeah, that works too. But yeah, so notice we're doing the same exact thing, passing down something through a context, not through props, and getting it in our class-based component or our function-based component. Again, I didn't really just distinguish these two visually, but this one is our class-based component and this one is our function-based component. But they're doing the same exact thing, have the same exact values. I guess this one we didn't wire up differently. But okay, yeah, the other way with class-based components, you do have a few options. You can do, if you don't want to do, I guess, this sort of syntax, you can get away with it by, I think you can just remove all this stuff. Go back to what we had before. But now we're going to add a line after our class definition. We're going to add class button dot context type, and then we're going to set that equal to our context. All right, so this is another way, and when you do this, you have access to this dot context. All right, so once you tie the context type to a particular context, inside each instance, you have a particular context value. So if I do it this way, that should, yep, notice this doesn't change. Obviously, it'd be better if we actually saw it change. So let's change our default value to maybe like 77. No, let's go with 44. Okay, so notice that we still render it. That works. So yeah, that's definitely easier, cleaner syntax. Someone remember the caveat with using context type.
I believe that means it's only one context that you can use.
Yep, you got it, Jeremy. Yeah, so in this case, we only have one context, so this is totally fine. But imagine if we created like 3 more contexts. This is not going to work. Like we can't just like chain them together in commas or whatever. At that point, we had to go through a different means. We could try to create like a composition context by combining all those contexts in a single context, or we'd have to go back to what we're doing before with our consuming inside of our render method. So this is convenient, but only is limited to one context in our class-based components. So again, we're talking about class-based components. I know we're bouncing around between class-based and functional-based, but kind of want to just tie up using context in either case. Any questions about context, why you would use them, how you would use them, where you would use them?
So one of the primary patterns that I've seen with using context is like permissions on a user, because you're going to need that throughout the entire application. So if you have conditionally rendered components based on the permissions of a particular user, having that user's permissions in a context is a pretty useful pattern.
Absolutely, yeah. User credentials, like I'm still working on my rock, paper, scissors application, but in that case, like we're using tokens. So that token is often used in many, if not all of your components. So yeah, and that would be a good case of having like a user context, have the token value available so that any component that needs to like do an authorized request to your API can just grab the token rather than rather than requiring you to pass down props to each of the components with a token value. So yeah, context, that's one use case of context for sure. All right, so kind of want to get out of our class component. Let's do one more thing, and then we'll kind of stop with this example. It's been kind of lengthy. So I have those render counts. It's a state in my parent. Oops. All right, so let's see. I'm actually curious. I actually don't know this. Can I do a use effect and track a context value? I think I should be able to, but let's find out together. So I'm going to have a use effect. Let's monitor render counts. And I actually don't know if this worked.
You're missing a closing square bracket.
Thank you, sir.
Inside the parentheses.
All right, let's just do a console log render counts. All right, so hopefully I'm not sure if use effect can do this. We could probably Google it, but let's just find out through trial and error. So render count, if that changes, I want to print out each time, and let's actually have it changeable. So let's quickly put a input. Handle, what I want to call it, cluck. I'm going to click handle click. As I'm typing, again, if you guys come up with any questions, please stop me. I know coding on screen isn't the most glamorous thing to watch, but Q&A is much more engaging. Handle click is just a function, and they'll take an event that I don't really care about. So I'm just going to call set render count and just increment it by 1. So render count, and we'll do render count plus 1. All right, so this again, anytime we click on the button, it's going to just increment the render count, and that render count is being passed to our context, so our context value will change. And hopefully, if use effect works with context values, we should be able to see. Let's actually. No, we're not going to print it out. We want to check use effect. So we'll just see if we're getting console logs for the render counts. And okay, I got this object. Where did that come from? Sorry, I'm totally confused. Where did this render count thing come from? Oh, is that a button? Oh, that is a button. Gotcha. All right, that's my parent component. Sorry, I was using some display elements. All right, so notice that the render counts are updating through my context, but I want to see if my use effect is getting called. Yep, it seems like I am console and logging that. So use effect does work with context values also. All right, so 71 is being what's printed out, and that's the current context value. So use effect can be used in that manner. The quick, can I think about an example where I want to use this? So
in the user being on context example, when a user's logged out, you could use that as a conditional render. So if the user changes, you could conditionally render what the username is or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, that's, again, very useful for when you have like authentication cases. This, I don't have this, render count. Okay, I think I know what I want to do here. So I'm going to all right, this is going to be kind of nonsensical, but let's just go with it. All right, I'm going to have a input value here. All right, apologies for my messy code, but I'm just going to add an onChange handler here for another input that I just created. And this we'll call handle input. And this will just be whatever. All right, so handle input, I'm going to create that function. Change, and effects. So monitor my input value. Probably should do this in my fun button. Let's see. Yeah, let me quickly roll this. Now I'll continue with this. Sorry. All right, so we'll have an input value here and set input here. It's going to track input. Here, so I want to do set render count. Sorry, I'm losing track of what I want to do. So let's just abandon this. Hopefully you guys kind of understand the purpose of context, but that was my last hook that I wanted to cover. All right, so with that, we're hitting 10:30. We have probably like 20 or so minutes before we'll take a break and then get to our corporate presentation. In those 20 minutes, I want to focus on what you guys want to see. So Michael Zura, you had mentioned you want to see API calls. So let's definitely do that because that was requested. So let me clean up my code a little bit. App can be cleaned up. Okay, let's call a third-party API. Michael Zura, do you have any third-party APIs that you have in mind or have kind of been eyeing before? Maybe we could try to read documentation and use it.
I'm going to be using the MLB baseball one, but you don't have to use that one.
No, I'm curious. Let's see, MLB API, is there a particular name for it? Data API, is this the one? Or is it a few of them?
Yes.
Okay,
that's
cool.
it.
This is on some GitHub page. They have documentation, which is great. APIs without documentation can be obviously really hard to use, but it looks like we can call this host and we should be able to get some data back from it. So I'm not sure what a .bam format is, so that might be something. But let's actually just go to this URL and see what we get in our browser. Lookup service, we need to probably provide some values. Player data, so okay, so we provide, that's the information we get back for player. Okay, so this is what we're going to call. And we should get data back. Okay, so we went to this endpoint, and we're going to get a JSON object back. So this is what we're going to be consuming. So we'll keep this up, and let's actually make sure we understand the format here. Okay, so we're going to link to this API. Let's do it in our fun button. It's really a fun button. So again, going for API calls, you usually want to do it after your component renders. That's where component did mount comes into play. So in this case, let's say let's do it on input. So every time we enter a value into our input field, so let's see what we have here. Yeah, so when you click the button, our input's going to be updating. Our handle input change is not being used right now. So anytime we submit, let's say a player name, that's when we should fetch from the API. So in that case, we'll do it in our use effect of input here. All right, so we're going to make an API call only when the input changes, but we don't want to do it on our initial, but we can maybe get around that. So if input is empty string, we can just ignore this. Otherwise, we want to make an API call. All right, so I'm going to do all this here. We're going to do a fetch. Also, we're going to do async function, so I'm going to do that separately. So function get player info. It's going to be async function. Hopefully you guys are pros with async await. And that's going to return some info object, I guess. Okay, so we'll do let response equal, we're going to do a fetch on this. Fetch. And then that would be response. We're going to expect some JSON back, so we're going to process the JSON. We're going to do some awaiting here. All right, so wait, again, is going to wait till those promise resolves. And then JSON is another promise that gets created. We're going to wait for that result and then return the info. So when we get our info back, I guess we want to set our info. So we'll do set info into okay, so I need to create this setter. That's going to set this info object directly into our player info. We could prune it as necessary, so we'll have another state. Let's call that const player info. Set player info. Okay, so we're creating a state value. We're going to update this as we get data back from our API that we're calling. So we're going to do state. This is going to be an empty object. Okay, so just to review, this use effect is going to get triggered on our initial render and also anytime our input value changes. Our input value is going to change whenever the user, being us, clicks that button to submit their input field value. Okay, so we're still using that ref for that input field value, so we can extract the value. Click the button, update our input. When that input actually updates, it'll call our use effects over here. Let me clean this up. See, this use effect will be triggered from the button being clicked. And then if our input value is empty, we don't have anything to fetch. But if we actually do have a value, we're going to call this function. So get player info and with our input value. All right, so that's going to take in some input. Let's just say that's player name. And then let's read our URL here. So we have search player all, support code MLB, active SW. I'm not sure what that is, but we'll just keep that. So here we want to pass our actual player name. Does anyone know who Cespedes is? Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, the active SW is active players, and then you can also put retired.
Gotcha. Okay.
Or
so
you can do all.
Active player name, and then we need to make this interpolation. So add in this stuff. All right, so I basically took the sample URL they gave and substituting in a player name as we choose, and that should return some info. So let's we spy on the info here. And okay, I think that was it. So basically, all we had to do was set up a use effect, spy on whatever value we care about, and then we could use that value to make a fetch call to that API endpoint. Let's see what our info looks like. So I'm going to restart this. Player info, that's fine. Okay, so a lot of garbage here. Let me clean up my fun button so that we could actually see something useful. So we'll do player info and probably show some player info here. Any questions about using APIs, what I'm doing, what we're trying to achieve?
I think you might have said it, but when do you have two awaits in that function? When do you need an await?
So you need to use an await when you're dealing with promises. So again, this sort of goes back to reading documentation, but fetch always returns a promise, and .json also returns a promise. So if you don't have this awaits here, and I've done this accidentally when I've coded in front of you guys before, if you don't have this await here, what's actually going to happen is we're going to call this fetch, and then we're going to automatically go to line 40 right after that. So this response value will be a promise, and we're going to execute this right away. So it's not actually going to have anything to process for JSON. So it's going to execute this entire function synchronously. So this async actually doesn't really do anything. And it's going to return something that's not what we expect it to be. It's going to return a promise. And this is something I've not mentioned before, and maybe I've confused you guys because I've probably said it incorrectly. Anytime you have an async function, automatically this function is going to return a promise. So this object is actually a promise object. Even though I haven't created a promise, like notice I've not created a new promise in this function, async function automatically will convert this return value into a new promise. So whoever is calling this function, if they care about this return value, has to also deal with that promise. So if I actually had like a let player info, I actually want to use this value, I either have to have await here, which I can't do because use effects, this function can't be async. So in this case, I got to use a .then if I actually want to process it out here. Sorry for that tooltip. But yeah, again.
Could you also just assign a await to the return on line 42?
That's a good question. I don't think that would work because this return value gets converted to a promise. But we could try that if we get a second, but I don't think that would work in the manner we'd want it to. Okay, let me just get this working and then we'll use that player info. So render player info not defined, right, because I was creating that. So okay, let's give this a shot. So player info is empty because we don't have anything. Michael Zura, can you name me your favorite MLB player if you have one? Last name?
Votto, V-O-T-T-O.
V-O-T-T-O? Like that?
Sammy Sosa.
Votto, like that? Michael Zura?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, let's try this out. So I'm going to click. All right, we got an error. That's fine. Seems like we didn't get a response back, so debug mode. Refresh. Let's try that again with Votto. Click me. All right, so now we can actually inspect what we're getting back. So I assume I didn't call my call this endpoint correctly, so I'm probably getting some error code here. So I got a promise. Oh, because I took away my awaits. There we go. So that's what happens if you don't have those awaits. You're going to be dealing with a promise and not the actual value. So that was my bad there. Let's try this again. Yep, cool. Okay, so click me. All right, nothing happening. Let's actually inspect what values we're getting. And again, I'm surprised no one yelled at me, but thank you for not yelling at me. But try catch always good practice whenever you're dealing with async awaits. So let's set this up and let's just console error that error. Okay, let's see if we're actually hitting here. Okay, so we get an error. Why did we get an error? All right, it's not letting me look at my values, so we're gonna have to go. Why are you calling us all the time? All right, not sure what's going on. Let's look. So we got component did mount, that's fine. We got a 77 from somewhere. I'm not even sure where that's coming from, but okay, let's try doing this one. Vado. Okay, we got an error. What is this error though? We're getting it multiple times. All right, I'm not even sure what my code is doing at this point, so I'm really lost. Yeah. So we're calling this kind of click, set input. All right, I don't, I'm just gonna get rid of this. Use effects. So we have position that we're not using. I can go away. So we only have one use effect for our input and our initial render.
There's a comment in chat.
Comment in chat. Thank you. There was something in the docs about putting %25 or something if you only search one word. All right, thank you. That's where I failed. I did not read the documentation. I was trying to copy and paste, which is always bad. Let's figure that out. So name part required. Yeah, I think we have that %25 after, and that's what they have here. Yeah, we have that %25. So I'm not sure if that's the issue, but thank you for that suggestion. So I'm going to try to quickly debug in the few minutes that we have left. All right, so yeah, that's all good. Get rid of my class-based components. Do this. All right, so Plato, book me. Oh, I know why. I have my errors filtered out like that. Yep. I still don't have an error here. All right, there we go. Okay, so we did get an okay response. So our response was okay. For some reason, our JSON is not happening. Nope, we have, all right. I don't know why our error breakpoint's happening. It could just be VS Code being silly. All right, so we're getting our info back. This is working correctly. We're getting, again, I looked at my response object and noticed it had a status code of 200, which means it was okay. And then we did our JSON, and our JSON is this dictionary. Let me pull it up for you guys. It's a little too large, but it's fine. So search player all, we get an object back. That is search player all as a field, and then a bunch of values in there. So we have copyright data, query results, looks like what we want. So we have one person that matched the query of Vado. Position is first base, birth country is Canada, his weight is 220. So we're getting all this information about this player. Let's actually print this out and then kind of get to see this in action. So let me use the size there. And okay, so we get this info. Let's prune our info. So we do search all, query results. Okay, so what do I want this? Let's do this here. So let player info equal return here. So I'm not actually going to set it here. Return info. And let's try returning info here. So we're doing that await that we kind of talked about. And let's see what our player info looks like here. And then we need to do set player info. Okay, so I forget who suggested it, but the question was, can we just return an await on the value? And will that be fine? The question is, do we need a await here or not? We can't use await because this is not an async function. But let's see if this will actually return our value or if it actually returns a promise, even though we're waiting on this line. That's a breakpoints. Okay, hopefully that's fine. Why is I getting hits? Oh, because my initial, gotcha, I see. So that's my initial mount. Okay, let's type in Vado, click enter. Okay, so player info, notice this is a promise still. So this promise is not resolved. So again, async functions automatically convert a return value into another promise. So in this case, I need to do a .then, because this is still a promise that's being returned to me. So I'll do a .then, do some business with the player info that I get back. Let's get rid of that. Player info. And we'll use that player info in here. I know we only have a few more minutes, so I'll wrap this up hopefully. Player info has some stuff in it. Let's just do let I'll get my name confused, so let info equal that. All right, let's just do, let's see. Position will be info dot, what was it? Again, I need to look at this again. All right, so we get search player all, and then we want to do query results. So info dot search player all, is it? And then we want to do query results. Info results dot total size. Okay, so total size 0. We'll just return out of this. Otherwise, we'll have at least one result here. So let's use the top result. Query results 0. All right, sorry, I'm kind of failing on using this. So this is an object that has a row value in it. That's an object. All right, row, and what do we want? We want position. So position is the first item. So position. Okay, we're just getting one value out of here, and we'll show that in our render here. So and here we'll do info player info position. All right, so I'm doing this quickly, so I might make mistakes, and we'll take a break shortly, I promise. Let's run through this. Probably have errors. Vado. Position. Let's put a breakpoint here. Okay, that executes. We call set player info, new player info. All right, so I'm gonna abandon this because I'm sure there's mistakes here. All right, we actually got first base. That looks like 20. All right, there we go. Sorry. So we got first base as our position. So can anyone else name another player? And let's see if this is gets us the data. Jose, you had a player you mentioned, Sosa. I think he's retired, so we're gonna change our call a little bit. Again, we probably want to do this more dynamically, but I'm doing this hard coded, so I think it's retired. All right, let me find this quickly. All right, I'm not sure where I would find this in documentation, but I'm sure it's there. Search for players, active, parameter. You can omit this parameter. This will slow down. Okay, so we can just omit it, and that should get us retired players also. So it'll be active and retired, I believe. Let's get rid of this. Not sure how this stuff is. Oh, okay, that's a yes. So let's put that no there. Sorry. So I think that was a Y. I'm changing it to N. I'm assuming that's no. And let's find Sammy Sosa. Continue. Okay, we don't need these breakpoints. All right, last thing we're doing, I promise. All right, let's see if Sosa works. What position do you play? Do you play first base also?
He played outfield, or I don't remember honestly.
Actually, I remember him catching balls in outfield. All right, so that failed. Not sure why. Okay, so I screwed something up. So unfortunately, we can't get data on Sammy Sosa. Let me try removing that entirely. All right, let's give this a try. Sammy Sosa, are you with us? All right, sorry, can't get Sammy Sosa data because I'm not using the API correctly, but there is a way to do it. I'm probably gonna do that on my break, but let's take a break before the company presentation. Hopefully the review was somewhat helpful. If not, I apologize for talking about functional components too long. Again, we'll do more review days going forward, so this wasn't the only review day. But with that, let's take a 7-minute break, and then we should have our corporate presentation ready to go at 11. So see you guys in a bit.
Thanks, Ankur.
Thank you, guys.